Hello, my name is Drew Daly with Omnitracs Data and Analytics. I'd like to thank you for joining us today and your interest in hearing about our new predictive model that targets driver turnover. What I'd like to discuss with you today is tell you a little bit about who we are and what qualifies us to do this, how the model was built, what does it predict and what does it prevent, most importantly, how does it work, and then what's the value to you? What will be the return on your investment for proceeding with this predictive model? To tell you a little bit about Omnitracs Data and Analytics, we have been in the predictive modeling and data analytics business for over a decade now. We're coming up on our 11-year anniversary. Formerly known as Fleet Risk Advisors, we were acquired by Qualcomm 8 years ago and rebranded last year to be Omnitracs Data Analytics. Our history is one that sees us focusing on primarily large fleets. If you look at the left side of this slide, you'll see a couple tiles named custom models. That's what we do. We make a living predicting bad things that happen to fleets. It's not that we don't care about small to mid-sized fleets, but in the historical data that we build our models on, we need a lot of bad things happening. We need a lot of historical events, a lot of crashes, quits, workers' comp claims, that sort of thing. And small to mid-sized fleets typically didn't have this level of data that we needed. So the models weren't effective. Recently, and that would be starting in November of 2015, we figured out a way to build what we're now calling industry models. As you can see on the right side, we've got two in place, accident severity and ELD driver retention. The latter is what I'm talking to you today about. Before I leave this slide, I'd just like to say that data and analytics is becoming increasingly prevalent in OmniTracks' overall product development cycle, trying to utilize the expertise that we've developed over the years. An example of that would be in early 2017, we'll be coming out with an active driver coaching product, which will be an in-cab device functioning in real time and based on real-time driver behaviors, looking to tell you when driver behaviors are outside of normal operating behaviors and almost making it a red light, green light scenario. The second one that's most interesting to me is the unification of our critical event reporting, video, and the predictive analytics that we have in place. What's really interesting about this, it sort of is the next evolutionary step in the sense that conventional programs like that today are reliant on either truck-based sensors or cameras to perform the analytics. With the predictive analytics based off of the driver that we have exclusive expertise, at least at this point, to, I think it'll really advance and make it a much more holistic product. So without further ado, here's a rendition of where I think the industry is today. If you think of data as a road and you're looking at things that happened in the past, you're looking at analysis and reporting. Analysis would be following an event and figuring out why it happened. Reporting would be that same event, what happened itself. I'd say the majority of the industry today is at the level of some form of either scorecard or dashboard, whatever you call it. And really what we're looking to do is get past dealing with what happened and try to identify what will happen and ultimately prevent that occurrence. So I'd like to start today by telling you how we built our model. I think that'll give you the foundational underpinning to understand how this model works. First and foremost, particularly if you're in the for-hire segment of the industry, that turnover has been a big issue for years. It hovers 90 to 100 typically in terms of for hire. We also know the forecasted shortfalls going forward in years to come of commercial drivers. We also know that labor costs are a very large component of your overall operating budget. And the way we built this model, and I'll explain it to you in subsequent slides, we can demonstrate, or I take that back, our analysis shows, based off the sample that we worked through when we built this model, that 63% of the voluntary quits occurred in 20% of your overall driver population. So if you want to focus on anybody to get the biggest return and do what's best for your fleet, that's the ideal scenario. We also know that just recruiting and keeping talent is a huge problem for everybody. And I think that's intuitive that you know that a 10-year driver is happier, safer, and more productive. So, to talk about how we built the model, first of all, know that we looked at every client that Omnitracs Data and Analytics has. In some cases, we had 7.5 years of data. We've got, we retain data because the long tail of our data allows us to do timeline-based analyses. Inside of that data sample, there were, and I'll just round these numbers, 373 terminations, 458,000 drivers involved, almost 22 million driver weeks, and so on and so forth. What's very interesting to me is if you think of hours of service as just 4 lines of data, know that when we're done with it and the multiple points that we both use raw data and what are called derived data points from, we end up with 1,147 distinct points for modeling purposes. So are we predicting? And this is taken directly from our clients. Typical things, work-life issues, change career, resigned. You guys know the drill here. You deal with this. You live this. Know also that we typically see a 2/3, 1/3 split between voluntary terminations versus involuntary. So we're targeting the voluntary side where you would prefer to retain that driver. Also, what was very interesting to me, myself having 35 years in the industry, I would have bet you that the majority of the quits occur on a Friday or Monday. It's actually not the case at all. Looking at that historical sample, you can see the breakdown. It's every day of the week. And I think that's sort of counterintuitive to what most people think. And I think that just underlines the fact that drivers don't have a knee-jerk reaction to quit. It's something that they're thinking about, and it's something that's deliberated in their own mind. So if that's the case, you can also intercede and short that process. Okay, whenever we build any model, we take the data set, which I've told you about already, but we also hold out a 3-month data set, and we do that for validating the model. So in this case, as I told you, we had up to 7.5 years of data, all that stuff I talked about a second ago. But the 3 months that we held out is viewed as you're seeing this now. This is 3 months that the model, after being built, tested, and validated, had never seen. So after we do that, we point the model at this previously unseen data set, and we ask it to tell us what's it going to do, what's it going to predict. So in this case, we identified 2 distinct populations. The first being in the 10% of drivers that the model deems as most at risk, that's where 43% of the voluntary terminations occurred. The second distinct population is that green bar, and that's what's called the 80th decile, or the next nearest 20% of or next nearest 10% of the population. They had 20% of the quits. If you look at the 2 together, 63% of all the quits occurred in 20% of your drivers. So again, I'll bring up one word: focus. This is an example of the data elements and how they relate to the predictability and probability of quitting. When you're talking shift start variance, that's the changing start and finish times of any given driver. All of our reporting like this is normalized to one being normal. And the way to read this is if you've got a shift start variance with a given driver of up to 30 minutes, he's got a 520% more probability of quitting as opposed to somebody else in different categories. So that is a predictor to us. Another view, we just total driving hours per week. Again, it's normalized, but if you've got less than 15.6 driving hours per week, driving being taken from the logs themselves, that would be, I believe that's 850% more likely to quit. This is an example of a data point that is probably more intuitive to you, but know that, as I said, we break this down into 1,147 different points, and it gets quite computationally heavy on the back end. Okay, so let's talk about how the model works in production. First of all, I mentioned a couple terms just a second ago, first being decile management. I'd like to introduce two concepts if you're not familiar with them. Decile management is just simply put, breaking up your driver population into 10 buckets. This is an example of a 100 driver fleet, and you can see 10 drivers in each bucket. Now, if risk were equal across all the drivers, we would see a flat line in terms of the probability of a driver quitting. They appear to have similar risk profiles, and it's obviously uniformly distributed, being the fact that it is a flat line. In reality, it's anything but that. We know that the model will look for the historical patterns that predict who's most at risk to voluntarily terminate. We know that as you go from right to left, that's a line that's called a lift curve in modeling. We know that the drivers on the left are much, much more likely to quit than the lower risk drivers as you go towards the right. And this would be our recommended starting focus group for this particular model. Start with 10% of your drivers who are most at risk. And how do we do that? We use a term called remediation. Remediation is a fancy word. I say that tongue-in-cheek. It's not a fancy word. But basically, we're going to teach you and empower you with data to have a meaningful conversation. Sometimes it's a phone call. It can be face-to-face. We'll talk about that stuff when we're implementing the program. But basically, it's about a 5 to 10 minute conversation with the at-risk driver every week. And it's those drivers that you're looking to take countermeasures so that you can find out what it is that they don't like that's not working and make appropriate operational adjustments. The flow of the process is really quite simple. First and foremost, the only data point that we need to operate the models themselves are electronic logs. We have interfaces built for most providers of e-logs, but we will take them from the in-cab units, run them into our data warehouse. For those people who are OmniTracks clients, know full well that we're held to the same contractual standards in terms of confidentiality, et cetera, that everything else is. But from that data flow, we pull off the e-logs, run it through the ELD driver retention model, and we'll be looking to, starting with that top 10%, the red bar that you can see, smaller this time, we're going to look to identify that 10% of driver who are most at risk. We do that utilizing a tool called the Driving Center. It's a permission-based portal, permission being an example, if you're in charge of recruitment and retention, you would get enterprise-wide visibility into the entire program. If you designate certain people to make these remediation calls, those people would only see the drivers that are assigned to them. So Driving Center for us is workflow, communications, and measurement. We'll tell you who's at risk, why they're at risk, where we suggest you start the conversations with, and then I will show you in subsequent slides just how we measure and what it looks like through some screenshots of a dummy site we've created for you. Now, I said that we do this on a weekly basis. We can also do this on a daily basis if you prefer. Every customer we've ever signed for an industry model opts for the weekly basis. One, because it correlates most closely to a typical work week. And two, I think it's just a function of what can be done from a workload perspective. So let me show you the driving center, as I said. This would be a scroll down. After you put in your user and password, it would bring you to a page like this. Know that we use the driving center across all of our models, and we do a lot of customization inside of this just as a display for some of our clients. But in this case, you can see we're talking a retention log model. So if you were to click on that tile, it would bring you to the list of drivers who are most at risk. Now this is dummy data, but you can see there's a column there which is a scoring. We deploy a 1 through 100 mechanism, with 100 being the most at risk. So we will display the drivers who are most at risk at the top. Now, practically speaking, the way this happens, if you have multiple people assigned to make those calls, and most typical fleets do, this would be routed to that appropriate person for the driver that they're responsible for, and that would arrive as an email in their inbox. In the message would be a hyperlink that takes them right to the page, or actually to the next page that I'll be showing you. Before I leave this, you can also see that we've got a lot of, any good software program has ability to slice and dice data to provide appropriate analytics for you. So if you wanted to see how this program is performing by a given manager or terminal, or if you're structured in regions or dedicated fleets, however you're organizationally established, we will look to set this program up accordingly. So if I was to click on James Hall here, being the top at-risk driver, it will take you to a display which is all things about Mr. Hall. Now, what we haven't displayed quite fully is you should know that up top, we will have a bunch of demographic data about Mr. Hall. Typically things such as what truck is he driving, what terminal is he affiliated with. We get into contract and physical, CDL and physical expiration dates. We can even display gross pay, net pay, miles driven, hours of service, duty status. Again, we'll talk with you and we'll customize the display so it reflects what you would like. Our thought process is the more information we put in one spot about any given driver, the more empowered and the more informed that conversation will be. We'll also have historical information, such as, has Mr. Hall been at risk before, documenting the conversations, so you get a historical view of the program. Now, as far as where to begin, if you look at these 5 green boxes, I don't expect you to fully understand this today. This would be delivered quite extensively when we're rolling out the program and training you guys. But this is where we suggest you begin the conversations. We break it down first and foremost into one sort of general box, which is the attributes of having a good conversation. Again, we teach on this. But then furthermore, we break down the causation into either personal and family, or it can be professional or management or skills-based. And depending on what it is, as an example, if it's skills-based through the course of conversation, you find out that you've got a fairly new driver and he's got a problem doing something functionally. If you get him the appropriate get him the appropriate training, that would be the appropriate countermeasure in that case. professional and management is interesting. A lot of times we see that as just friction between the driver and his or her manager. As a side conversation to this, we've got a number of our clients who have adopted specialists or advocates, and we can talk about this one-on-one, but we typically see better results. And then last but not least, and I think this is an important one, because many times the model discovers, and through a course of conversations, that the driver has some personal issues that he's dealing with. We've seen anything as severe as children with cancer, to sick spouses, to financial problems, divorces, things like that. And it's really neat in the sense that this is a different kind of conversation than your people typically have with the driver. I'd say the majority of conversations with the driver are transactional, very black and white about the job function. Things such as, when are you going to be there? When are you going to be empty? What's the delay? You guys know the drill. When you get into the relationships that are more on a human level, a non-transactional level, it's amazing just how beneficial it is. Last but not least, there's a box in there that we've found, and we've been asked time and time again to give a basic level of fatigue management. And since this model is based off of hours of service, I think it's just it's doing ourselves a just service to give you a basic level that you can convey and interact with towards the drivers, typically through your probably safety meetings in this case, but it'll deal with things, especially if you're working non-9 to 5 type hours, how to reduce fatigue and thus reduce all sorts of bad things that could happen, quits, crashes, etc. As I scroll down this page, you get at the bottoms of the green boxes we just discussed, you'll have a gray box here. That would be the predictors as to why this particular driver is deemed at risk. These will change on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Again, part of the training that we deliver is understanding what this means and how that relates to starting the conversation that is capsulized in the green boxes above it. Last but not least, before I leave this, you can see that we ask for a documentation of that conversation. The reason we do that is we apply analytics, which I'll show you in just a second, but know that it's very easily done. Things such as, when did the conversation occur? Where did it occur? What was the tone of the conversation? And then just a free-form field, we ask you to document exactly what was discussed. Last, if you do want to schedule a follow-up, and we always think that's a great idea, particularly with certain issues, you could click on, just like you could in Microsoft Outlook, let's say, you could click on a specific date and follow up, let's say, 1 week later. And again, that reminder would show up as an email in your inbox, taking you right back to the page so you can see where you stood. Now, I told you why we ask the documentation. 2 reasons. First of all, we apply text analytics. Text analytics, I think everybody's familiar with the concept, word clouds, what have you. When we went out, and this is about 2 years ago, we thought we could buy something like this off the shelf since there are a lot of text analytics engines available. We found out that nothing understood the trucking lexicon, so we ended up having to build it ourselves and subsequently patenting it. But it's a tool that allows for continuous improvement of the program. It allows for trend analysis, both inside of the program, and sometimes we see it external to the program. And then we also have an employee efficiency ranking. That's what you're looking at on the right. Now, I borrowed from a live customer. That's why I whited out the last names in this case. But this is a large fleet with almost 1,000 drivers in one terminal location. We do a stack ranking of their managers that looks into things like program outcomes, sentiment analysis, the amount of times they log in, the quality of the conversations from reading the words themselves. There's any number of facets to analyze it. But in this case, we do a stack ranking. This particular fleet utilizes this stack ranking as part of their driver manager incentive pay. But I think functionally, it'll allow you to say, hey, if you're at the bottom, if you're number 24 and 23, is it a case that you need additional training? Or I can tell you in one case, working with a fleet, that they knew they had a couple people who were really top shelf when it came to operations, but they just didn't have the soft skills necessary to have a personal interaction with the driver. So in that case, they reassigned the responsibility for the calls, and the results were much better. So that is the driving center. Now I'd like to discuss why and what we do to prevent driver turnover, most importantly. First and foremost, I've already told you we've been doing this for over a decade. Our biggest seller currently is our driver retention model. That's a custom model, which is different than the industry model in the sense that the custom models are built entirely on any one given fleet's data versus the industry model is based off of hours of service. They're both very highly accurate in terms of their predictive capabilities. There are a couple extras that you can do with a custom model, but the bottom line and what I'm trying to reinforce is we've got 10 years of proven success in reducing driver turnover. In the custom models, we'll typically see a fleet-wide reduction of 10 to 20% in the first full year of implementation. We are not only a predictive modeling organization, but we have become, over the years, experts in driver behaviors. Being that we're making that claim, we're more than happy to share best practices with you. We won't necessarily speak of specific accounts or details, but in an anonymized fashion, we'll let you know what's working well for others. We can document the workflow. I've already showed you that in the driving center. And importantly, when we do measure this, we have the ability to segment this program's effectiveness versus everything else you've got going on inside your organization. And I'm sure you're doing things to try to reduce turnover presently. The way we do that is we measure those drivers who are getting these remediation calls. Anybody who does not get a call is then the control group in our measurement. The difference between the control group and the people who got the calls, the difference is from the control group is, the only difference is that they've gotten a call and a remediation interaction with whomever it is making that call. And last but not least, we've been delivering sleep science and fatigue management for 10 years, and I think we do a pretty good job, and that's, I assure you, if you decide to go through with something like that, you'll see great benefits. What's very interesting on our existing clients, even though the primary objective of a driver retention program is to reduce voluntary turnover, we also know that when you have a tenured fleet, you've got a more productive fleet, you've got a safer fleet. So these are just a couple examples on a client-by-client basis of different measures that we are able to produce when they have an increased or decreased turnover factor. Pretty significant. I sometimes think that the secondary improvements are equal to, if not better than, the primary objective. Okay, so now let's talk about the value proposition. What's it worth to you and your fleet specifically? First of all, we took 6 different larger size fleets through field trials on this ELD driver retention model. The orange bar are the fleet sizes. The 2 white bars, counts of quits per month and counts of quits in the 90th decile. I think per month is fairly easy to understand. Let's use a 500 driver fleet. They were averaging 28 quits per month, of which 12 of them were predicted by the model. Okay, after going through and utilizing the model to try to reduce the turnover, I don't get into the details in terms of quits prevented here, but from a financial perspective, that 500 driver fleet had an ROI of 543%, or looked at another way, a multiple of 6.4. The way we measure that is very simply, we count the quits that we prevented or avoided times your average new hire cost. Here's looking at it a different way, and I purposely took a smaller example. This is a 100 driver fleet. The cost of the program on an annual basis is, and this is a misnomer, I'll explain this in just a second, but the recurring monthly fee adds up to $10,800 on an annualized basis. This is a fleet that had 67% voluntary turnover and had a $5,000 per driver new hire cost, which is widely acknowledged as the industry average. I've seen a range of anywhere between about $3,500 up to $12,000. That's typically depending on what type of mode you're in. Dry vans will be typically less expensive than tankers or flatbeds, that sort of thing. But anyway, with the program cost of $10,800, we avoided almost $70,000 worth of new hire cost because we retained those drivers for a net of $59,000. This particular scenario had a 6.5 multiple and a 546% ROI. And know that this is based on just the starting point of the 10% focus group. I think just about every client that I can think of offhand over time decides to migrate to a larger focus group. We've got customers who are remediating on 15 and 20% of their drivers. The reason being is once they know that the program works, the program cost stays the same, but by working more at-risk drivers, the return on investment increases. So an ROI projection, we have a tool that's being posted on our website. You could also contact me directly or ask your OmniTracks salesperson, but it's very simple. It's a spreadsheet. We could send it over to you. We ask you to input 4 different variables. That's up top shaded, and it's sort of a light orange or peachy color. We ask you to put in what your driver count is, what your new hire cost, and what your voluntary turnover percentage. Once that's inputted, you'll get our projection of the program cost, the gross and net savings, the number of quits prevented, and the ROI that's driven based off of your new hire cost. So you'll be able to get a projection which, in my opinion, is a fairly conservative projection. We utilize a 50% improvement in that risk, in that 10% focus area. Our 10-year average of improvement in that same focus area is 70%, but we're being purposely cautious and conservative. So that's most about the program. If you're still interested, what I'd like to review, and very briefly, what the next steps would be. First of all, we get a little agreement in place. It's 2 pages. It's nothing extensive, very straightforward. We would look to collect the data to begin the program. That's the very first, functional step, if you would. Electronic logs are mandatory. Can't work on paper logs. But if you're an OmniTracks or XRS customers, we already have access to this. We just want you to be aware and receive your permission. We do ask for 3 additional files, not necessary to run the model, but in terms of the ease of use and the functionality of the program, these 3 are very beneficial. And I've already talked about them. The first file would be the driver associations. That's knowing how you're organized, what driver manager manages what driver, what division they're affiliated with, what terminal, etc. The second would be driver demographics. Those are the things that I talked about before, truck number, terminal name, license, physical expiration, whatever you want displayed so that you can be more empowered or more knowledgeable. We would look to integrate and pick that up from you. And last but not least would be your driver employment records. That's twofold. One, so that we're only dealing with active drivers. We don't want to be looking at and scoring drivers who are no longer with your organization. And second of all, that gives us the basis to measure our performance. If we know somebody has quit and we predicted them to quit, that would count against us in this compared to what the model predicts. So those are the 4 data points that we work with. After that, it would just be a question of customizing the driving center according to your expectations and what you'd like to see, scheduling and delivering the training itself. We do that on site, and we'll typically spend a half a day. We'll not only tell you about the program and how to use the tool, but we typically will schedule that so that the first production of at-risk drivers would be arriving on that same day, and we can listen into some of the initial calls and do some coaching to the people who are making those remediation calls. All this can be done in typically 2 to 4 weeks. The quicker we have the data, and of course working with your availability from a scheduling perspective, it's not an extensive process. After that, it's just ongoing support and reporting. So I think that concludes today's presentation, and I'm be very happy to answer any questions you may have. It looks like I've got just a few questions, and let me try to read them for you. Question number 1, it appears data trends are analyzed over time. How do you account for the drivers who quit after a short time, say 1 to 2 weeks? Good question. Typically what we see is some segmentation in terms of driver tenure. It's not at all uncommon that we see specific groupings and specific patterns with drivers typically in the first 3 months, let's say, which certainly would encompass the 1 to 2 weeks as posed in this question. We also see different trends in 30 to 6 months and 6 months and above. So we have the ability to spot them and advise you accordingly. It would be part of the predictors that are created. The next question, are you saying that you can predict if a driver will quit based off of data collected from the OBC? The onboard connection, I'm assuming, is ABC. Yeah, the OBC, it basically is the tool that, through telematics, we would collect the electronic logs. Again, I think I made it fairly clear, but electronic logs are mandatory to run this model. With that, we can, operate the program. Let me see. How much the interview process affect retention? Okay, I'm not sure what that means, but if I can interpret this question, which is coming in online, it's how much does the remediation call impact? In other words, what type of results can we expect to have from this very human, non-transactional intervention? We typically, and we just completed a 10-year study of every client we've ever had, and the 10% focus group, which is always our recommended starting point, we typically see a 70% reduction regardless of the model objective. By that I mean we have safety models, we have driver retention models, we have workers' comp claim models, etc. But in the focus group, we typically see a 70% reduction. Said another way is if we look at that on a fleet-wide basis, it's a 10 to 20% reduction. Okay, will these slides be available somewhere? Yes, I believe they're going to be available, and I think they'll be sent to you. I'll have to double check on this, but I think it's going to be forwarded out after the conclusion of this webinar. Okay, appears data trends are analyzed. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. I asked that question already. Okay, what are the specific items evaluated that tend to lead to voluntary quits? I heard you mention drive time amounts. Are they all hours of service based? Yes. When I mentioned earlier that we have 1,147 distinct data points, they're all taken from 4 lines of data, but we'll take things, and I know I mentioned shift start as an example, but we can also look at dwell time. We look at drive time, but we'll also break those things down. We'll look at the total number of hours. We'll look at the breakdown as to, is it 1 hour driving, 1 hour off duty, et cetera, et cetera. We can also look at it on a weekly, on a day-to-day, on a week-to-week basis. So we're looking at them from all different perspectives. Looking through, I've got a bunch of things here. Okay, here's one more. Why only 10% focus? It's not that we're saying that that's all you can do. That's our recommended starting point. Until somebody who's new to a program is comfortable with not only the tool, but how to have these types of conversations, which we coach through the training. But when you're comfortable and you start to see that the program works and you start to get some validation, typically coming from the drivers themselves, that's when it's almost unanimous, in my personal experience, that the customer themselves at some point will come to us and say, hey, this thing is working. Let's, can we get more bang for the buck? And that's when we'd recommend either to step up to remediate more of the drivers, let's say from 10 to 15 or from 10 to 20, or in some cases we can increase the frequency. In this model's case, we can go from a weekly to a daily, if that makes sense to any given operation. Let me see. I only see one more question here, and that's why fatigue? I think that refers to part of the deliverable with our training. We educate fleets in terms of sleep science. Another way of saying that is fatigue management. I think that's getting increased scrutiny from Washington, D.C. Other countries do a much better job than the U.S., in my personal opinion, in terms of managing and educating the drivers to be more attentive and to deal with scheduling. So since this model is based off of hours of service, which is another way of saying the driver's personal time, we think it's very complementary to give you that foundational underpinning. And we've been training along these lines for 10 years, and we always see very, very positive results. So, yeah, I just got confirmation that recording will be forwarded out to the attendees tomorrow. So at this point, I'm not seeing any other calls, but you can see that my contact information is on that last slide, so by all means, feel free to reach out if I can help you. And I thank you for your time today.